Okay, thanks everybody for joining us. We're just going to get started in a moment here. I'm Jess. I'm just going to hand over the screen control to my colleague Florian, who will be presenting to you today.
Hello and welcome. Before we get started with the content of the webinar, a quick comment. If there should be any issues with connectivity, so with your internet connection or our internet connection, don't worry too much about it. We will record this entire video and the presentation, and if there should be any issues, we can send you the recording afterwards so you can see it in full without any interruptions. So my name is Florian Engel. I'm the Managing Director of More Onion, and I work as strategy consultant in the area of online campaigning and online fundraising. So I also support organizations with the strategy. More Onion is a digital mobilization agency. We work with nonprofit organizations across Europe in creative, strategy, and technology. So our focus is always digital mobilization in one way or another, whether that's for fundraising or campaigning. So all of the examples that we're using are from the nonprofit sector. Some of the work, some of the examples that we're going to be using are projects that we were involved with. Others are just examples that we've seen somewhere out there and that we thought are really great examples of the work that we're doing. This webinar is organized in partnership with NGO-Academy. So thanks for being a great partner on this one. NGO-Academy organizes trainings for NGOs and charities in Central and Eastern Europe. If you should have any questions as part of this webinar, please just ask questions. Like that, there is no such thing as stupid questions. How is that going to happen? So if you have any questions, please find the little speech bubble icon on your interface. So depending on the device that you're using, it may look slightly different. So sometimes it's a speech bubble, sometimes it just says chat. So you can ask questions through the chat interface using text input. What we will be doing is that we will be going through the different questions as you're posting them, and then we will have two sections within the webinar where my colleague Jess is going to go through the questions and we'll pick some and we will answer them on the webinar. If we don't get around to answering all of the questions, because sometimes there can be quite a lot, and this is a fairly big webinar, we will definitely get back to you after the webinar with the answers. So don't worry, all questions that you will be asking, we will give you an answer. We are not planning on having any breaks on this webinar. It will probably take around an hour. We might go over a bit depending on how much time we have for questions. All the content and material that we'll be showing you as part of this webinar, we will send that through as follow-up in a follow-up email. So you will receive an email with the slides and all the material that we mentioned. And depending on how it goes with the recording, also the recording. Jess, would you mind muting your microphone, please? Thank you. So what we will be doing today is that we will start by going through some of the introduction. So the introduction is where we're at right now. There are a few small steps to take. Then we will be talking about strategy and strategy models and what that means for online fundraising. Then the main part of the webinar will be the 10 tips for online fundraising. And then we will have a little section for the closing where we discuss next steps and have another round of questions. So before we get started, we have a few small polls prepared to get to know you a little better. Jess?
Okay, so we've just wanted to find out a little bit more about you, about who's on this call. So the first question we've got is something about where you are. Now the poll only allows us to offer a few different options. So I've picked out the countries that I could see most commonly represented in the sign-up list. And what I've asked, so our poll just has a few options. If you're from a different country, please do post in the chat if the chat window is available to you. I know depending on the client that you're using and the platform you're using, you may not have the chat window. So if you're from a different country, please tell us either in the chat or in the Q&A and I can read back out just so we can get a sense of who's here. So I'm going to launch the poll. Hopefully everybody should be able to see the options there and I can see the the responses coming in and the proportions. Okay, about 40% have voted, half. 58%. Couple more moments for people to fill in. %70%. I'm just going to give it a few more seconds. So I think a few people don't have access to the polls, so don't worry if you can't respond. It's just to give us a sense of who's here. So I'm going to close the poll now. Hopefully I should be able to display the results there. So we can see the distribution. So we've got about a third of the participants here are from Austria, or a little bit under a third, 10% from Hungary, nearly 20% from Romania, just 16% from the United Kingdom. And in the Q&A pane, it looks like most people don't have access to the chat. I've got nothing in there, but in Q&A pane, I've got Montenegro, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Slovakia, Bulgaria, Moldova, Slovenia, Croatia. So a wide range of participants from across Central and Eastern Europe and from the UK. Okay, so I'll hide that one. And then our second question is about your own relationship with this issue. So where do you see yourself as a fundraiser? So I'm going to post up a poll with a number of statements. Which of these describes you best? So I'm a fundraising specialist. Fundraising is maybe half or more of my work. Fundraising is less than half of my work. I'm not a fundraiser, but I want to know a bit more about it. Or none of these really apply to me. And again, you can post something in the questions if you want to give more detail there. So 40%, 58, 61. Just give everyone seems to find this one a little easier. Okay, 71% seems to have slowed down. So I'm going to close the poll now and share the results. So we can see quite a distribution. So probably the biggest category there is that fundraising is less than half of my work. About a fifth of you are not fundraisers, but want to know more about fundraising. And just under a fifth are fundraising specialists. So quite a distribution in terms of how deeply engaged with fundraising you already are. And just seeing what's in the chat. So yeah, it's less than half of people's work. So yeah, most of you, by the looks of it, are not pure fundraisers. It is just part of your work. So I'm going to close that poll now and hide that, and then hand back to Florian.
Thank you. So what that shows us are two things. One is we are a very diverse and distributed group. So some of the things that I'll be presenting may not apply to your particular context or your country. Other things might be really applicable. The same thing goes for the contents of the webinar. We only have so much time, right? This is just over an hour. So what we'll try and do is that we cover a wide range of different issues, and we'll do our best to find something that sort of is interesting for every one of you. Whether you'd be a fundraising specialist, there might be some stuff in here that you already know something, but we're hoping that we're going to share a few ideas that will help you to launch new projects. On the other side, if you have just started with fundraising or it's just a small part of your work, we're hoping that this is a good introduction, and we will cover some of the grounds and the steps that you need to take to develop an initial strategy and get started with your online fundraising. So let's get started with a bit of strategy. The reason why we thought it's important to get started with some top-level thinking is to show how all of these ideas and tips that we have actually fit into the wider context. We shouldn't be thinking about fundraising in isolation. So that is true for fundraising, but also for digital. So ideally, you don't think of online fundraising as something that you do that is detached from everything else that you're doing. ideally it is integrated with what your organization is doing and other activities that are going on. So what we typically find really helpful before starting to develop a basic strategy for online fundraising is to think about what type of organization are you? What type of organization are you working with? So a lot of people probably know Doctors Without Borders. We try to use like really famous or well-known examples to give you a sense of what type of organizations might be out there. So if you are Doctors Without Borders, you're clearly working in emergency response. So what that means is you have a really clear urgency because there's an emergency that's going on and you're responding to that. So in that case, most of the time when you do online fundraising, your issue is already quite newsworthy. And a lot of people will already know about it because it's a major disaster or it's something that is pretty big in terms of the world. It's also Doctors Without Borders is also an example of like having a very big brand. So if Doctors Without Borders does an emergency appeal, then it sort of works, and you can potentially ask for a donation straight away. In other examples, that might not be so easy. If you are an organization who provides services, then your donors might be either beneficiaries of the service or may have some other personal connection to the service. In this case, we've used Macmillan Cancer Support as an example because those who either suffer from cancer or their families and friends, they will have some kind of connection to Macmillan because of their services. So in that case, your fundraising might look at that first rather than finding potential donors in another way. And the third example is if your main activity is actually like with Greenpeace advocacy and campaigning, then that is your most important, most relevant base for potential donors, because everyone who supports your campaigns could also become a donor. And everyone who's actively donating, what they're donating towards is to make campaigns possible and to make mobilization possible, right? So everything is focused towards mobilization. Now, these are just 3 examples of what types of activities may be at the heart of your organization and what you really focus on. And we think it's really important that you focus, that you build your online fundraising strategies around that. Obviously, there are other factors like how well known is your brand? Are you Doctors Without Borders, or are you some local organization that is merely known in the neighborhood and you're trying to achieve something that goes beyond the local level? Then which kind of activities have worked in the past? That also applies to your traditional online traditional fundraising measures, such as like event-based fundraising or sporting events, whatever it is that has worked for you, that can inform your digital fundraising strategy. And of course, whether you're looking to achieve like specific long-term goals or short-term gains. What often happens in online fundraising is that short-term, or generally in fundraising, is that short-term financial goals are at the center of everything we do. But sometimes that's not very sustainable. So, but it's important when you develop a digital fundraising strategy that you consider that as well. Obviously, there are many other factors, but we'll be talking about those for a bit. So what often happens is as organizations are starting with their digital fundraising, they put up a donation form on their website and then nothing happens. So that is a good example of why we shouldn't be confusing ourselves with someone like Doctors Without Borders, because if there's no newsworthiness, if there's no urgency to the cause, and we're not doing something very specific to drive traffic and to sort of build relationships with potential donors, then just having a donation form is probably not going to get us anywhere. And also bear in mind, most organizations do not have a massive brand already. What that means is that people don't necessarily know you, so you will have to build a relationship before you can ask them for a donation. So building that relationship also has to be part of your strategy. and therefore it's also part of the online fundraising strategy aspect of your work, if you want to put it like that. So we often use a strategy model for that. So strategy models are essentially ways of trying to organize the chaos. So we're organizing all the different activities and all the different things that we're doing, and we're trying to make it easier and better to understand, and also better to navigate. So you can think of an online fundraising strategy model as some sort of map that allows you to navigate through the landscape, and that allows you to sort of reach your final destination. So if your long-term goal is clear, you can mark it on the map, but you will need a strategy model of some sort to be able to figure out how to best get to that long-term goal. What is the best route for you to navigate? And obviously that might really differ depending on the organization that you work with, or the context that you work with, the country that you work with. So while you can definitely borrow some of the aspects of the things that I'm about to show you, it will really have to be tailored to your organization to make sure that it matches the environment that you operate in. So what I think is important to be able to use a strategy model is, first of all, a clear framework for projects. So only if you can identify specific projects that you can make happen, and you can place them in the right point in your model. You can think of them as like sub goals. As you're navigating the landscape, it's like a destination where you might have a break on your journey towards the final goal. So a clear framework of how projects can happen. Obviously tied to that is the ability to measure the success of these projects. So you're measuring success towards the long-term goal, but you're doing that through measuring the success of a sub-project. The third point is that these objectives are actually integrated. So it's not just one project that's going to happen in isolation. It's actually integrated with the long-term objective, and one thing leads to another. So it's not just that you go out there and do one thing. All the activities are tied together. And the last point is something that we think is particularly important when talking about digital, and that is that the supporters are at the center of everything that you do. So it's not you or your organization at the center, it's actually the supporter and the people that you're talking to and the people that you're interacting with. So by designing something and thinking of a strategy that really is a great story from their perspective, you can unlock the potential of your online fundraising. So let me give you an example. So this is a 6-step model. I will quickly talk you through it. As I've mentioned, depending on the organization that you work for, it might not work exactly like that for you, but it will probably, with small adaptations, work for like 90% of the organizations out there. So first of all, attention. That is where you get your potential donors' attention. In the world of digital, that is usually translated into traffic. So if someone visits your page, that is traffic. So they might be seeing a post on social media or an ad, and then they click on the link and they land on your landing page. That is how attention works. The second step is activation. That is for some organizations, it might be an online petition. For other organizations, it might be a quiz, or it might be signing up as a volunteer, or some small action that can happen. But it's an opportunity for people to leave an email opt-in. So what that means is, from this point onwards, you can actually communicate with these supporters via email. And you can build the relationship, and you can get to know them, and they can get to know you a little. And that leads us to point 3, engagement. Engagement means that you constantly work on this relationship. You stay in touch with your supporters. In most cases, that happens via email, and you make sure that they are still around after, like they keep taking actions. They're engaged after a certain period of time. And only then you can turn your attention to revenue and to donation asks. So as part of that engagement, you can start asking for the initial donation, for an example, asking for a small one-off donation to begin with. And then one step further, you can ask them to also make a monthly donation or just make a bigger donation to your organization. And the sixth point is also really important, that is retention. That is where you actually make sure that as many people as possible stick around to also keep giving. So you really focus on retaining as many of these people as possible. If you turn that model into, if you just put it down on paper and you turn it, you can see the 6 steps at the top. So it starts off with attention. And the little, this is an example of a project mapping. So how you can organize projects that you're doing in your online fundraising work, how you can map them to the different stages of the model. So attention is often something like online advertising or promoting something on social media, on your own social media channels. It might be putting something on the front page of your website. It might also be shares. So if someone finds some kind of content on your site and they share it with their friends and family, that can also lead to attention. Number 2 is activation, as we've just discussed. A good example of that is an online petition. So people take action, they do something, and as part of that, they also provide you with an email opt-in. So they say, yes, I would like to receive further email communications. Step 3 is then engagement. That is where you stay in touch with these people who have expressed an interest and who've said, yes, please do send me emails. That can also be follow-up asks and follow-up interactions, like asking them to share the content or further online petitions or a quiz, whatever it is that you can offer. Revenue, a good example of that would be to run a crowdfunding action. A crowdfunding action is where you ask supporters to fund something very specific, and it's often focused on small gifts, so small one-time donations to raise enough funds to do something together. And upgrade is, in this case, an ask to make a regular donation, so an ongoing donation. So this is an example of a model where you can map all the projects in your model. And with loyalty and retention, so to keep as many of these people around, you send them, in this case, a sequence of emails that show the impact of the donation. So this is just sort of a very simple, straightforward application of the model. Now, of course, part of why that's really interesting to use is that you can also measure the success of each step. I'm going to give you a few examples, but at the end of the day, that will be really down to how you put your strategy together. So if you start with attention, that is how much traffic can you generate? You can measure how much traffic you're getting and how much relevant traffic, because sometimes you might get a lot of traffic, but they're not really interested. So the second thing is activation. You can measure the success of this stage by counting how many new email opt-ins you're getting. So how many new people are you starting that relationship with that is then going to lead to engagement. Engagement is a good measure of engagement is how many people are sticking around for and are still responding to your emails after like 3 months or so. So when you send them something, are they going to look at it? Are they going to interact with it or not? Revenue, there are 2 pretty obvious examples. One is how many new one-off donors have you recruited? So how many people have you managed to convince to make a donation for the first time? And the other one is how much money you've raised. Upgrade is how many people have you managed to persuade to sign up for a regular gift. And retention is how many of these people are still around after a year or 2 years or 3 years, depending on how you measure that. So that is just really briefly how you can put together a strategy model, how you can make sure that you can actually measure success. And that is the foundation of like most of the online fundraising strategies that we all work with. Now, do we have any questions at this point? If you have any questions, feel free to type them into the question box. I know this can be a bit abstract, but I thought it'd be a good foundation for the next section.
Okay, no questions yet, but should we just give people a moment or two to process and respond? Okay, first question in from Bianca Bizzetto. Could this model be used also having companies and not individuals in mind? So I guess for corporate fundraising.
I'll be perfectly honest, I don't have a lot of experience with corporate fundraising. Most of the work that we do is like online fundraising for organizations who receive donations directly. But generally speaking, yes, because what the model does is it essentially puts the supporter at the heart and thinks about like how the supporter and the relationship to the organization changes over time. So you can do the same thing with companies. You can say the company doesn't even know you yet, then you get their attention, then you have some sort of offer that allows them to stay in touch with you for a longer period of time, then you gradually build that relationship, and then you ask them to make the contribution. So definitely, it's definitely applicable. You might have to tweak it a little though.
Okay, thanks, Bianca. Any other questions? Okay, nothing for now, Florian. So okay. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A pane as we go through. So do please add your questions as we go. Okay, we've got one from Gabri. We have in our NGO different programs. Should a single fundraising manager look after all of them? I guess talking about different programs of work, presumably, or different fundraising programs.
I think that like without like much more context, it's really difficult to say, because in some cases it makes sense for people to have like really deep involvement with one particular area, and in other cases it makes sense to have that centralized within the organization. So I think there's no, it depends a lot on the context to be able to really say.
Okay, no other questions for now, so I'll put those to you at the next stage.
Okay, thank you. So now to the 10 tips. I want to get started with the first tip, and that is a model that you can be using. We've just discussed strategy models, but one of the tips is use something like fundraising via campaigning. So if you're already doing campaigning work, if you're already going out there mobilizing supporters, use that and apply the model and find a way to get these people who are supporting your campaigns to also make a donation, and the other way around. Try and integrate campaigning and fundraising. What you can see here is that is just like a little graph. It's the same model, but it's just visualized slightly differently. So attention, you have attention through a few different channels. Activation, in this case, is an online action, so it's an online petition. Then people will end up on the email list. From the email list, you can identify the segment of people who are particularly engaged. So that is the bubble on this graph that says warm, if you can read that. And these people are much more likely to actually make a one-off donation. So you can ask them to make a one-off donation as part of a crowdfunding campaign that you're doing. And then again, you have your email list, and here you will have the people who have made a donation already and the ones who've not made a donation yet. And by asking the people who've participated in the crowdfunding to make a regular gift or to make a higher gift, you will actually be able to recruit a good chunk of these people. So that is like a very simplified way on how you can go about implementing the fundraising via campaigning model. Number two, one example of how you can frame your online fundraising asks is to frame them as if they were a campaigning action. Now, if you do campaigning and mobilization, that can be very powerful. This example is from Friends of the Earth Germany, BUND, as part of their campaign against the glyphosate, which is a carcinogenic chemical. So what they did as part of this campaign is that they asked their supporters to fund an ad in the newspaper, and that was for the specific newspaper that they knew that the Minister of Agriculture would read, because he was a real fan of, an outspoken fan of that newspaper. So they asked their supporters to chip in and fund a full-page ad in the newspaper warning the minister about this chemical. Now, that worked really well because, first of all, it felt like taking part of a campaigning action. It's obvious what the impact is going to be. So you're making a donation, and in response, in return, you immediately get the impact. And in this case, we know that it worked well in terms of campaigning too, because someone from the members of staff of the minister actually ended up calling the newspaper and complaining about this ad. So we know that it also worked to get his attention. The third tip is use fundraising via emergency as a model. So if you do work in emergency response in one way or another, if that is something that you do now with COVID-19, obviously there's not much that we can do other than respond to emergencies because everything is somehow connected to COVID-19 and the crisis around it. But what I'm saying is, like, if you can use emergency fundraising, then you again use the model for it. And the model in this case is that you have an emergency fundraising ask, and you direct a lot of traffic to that, and you try and get small one-off donations. The goal here is not to raise a huge amount of money. The goal here is to get as many people to make a donation as possible. So these are then people that you can further work with. Again, a lot of these people will provide an email opt-in, so you can stay in touch with them. And once they're on the email list, you can eventually work with them. You can do some engagement, do something interesting, send them content, send them information about how their donation has worked, and then follow that up with a regular fundraising ask and ask them to also make a monthly contribution. So that is an example. But if you're not sure whether it's an emergency, if you're not sure that that is the way to go, then it's probably not. So emergencies only work if it's very obvious and immediately clear why people should be giving to this cause. The next example is to ask for a very specific thing in context of what you've been communicating in the past. Now, in comparison to just putting a donation form on your website, this means that you send, if you're in touch with supporters and you've been sending them information about the humanitarian crisis with refugees or some other issue, then also make sure that the donation ask is really well tailored towards them and references the exact issues that you've been communicating about in the past. So this is an example of Care International UK, and it's asking supporters to make a donation to support their work in the refugee camps in Jordan. So that is, and that specific ask has come in after the supporter had like a wide range of different emails over a few months, all about the refugee crisis. So make it very tailored and specific rather than just asking for a donation in general. Now, there are a few other things that you can try and that might work for you. We've already mentioned crowdfunding, so that's the next tip. Try and find something very specific and then organize a crowdfunding around it. Crowdfunding in this sense, like if you're a fundraiser, crowdfunding is just a fancy word for something that you've been doing for a very long time. But especially online, it makes a lot of sense to ask people to make a donation to something very specific. Like in this case, that's an example of an organization called Aktion Media. They're a German organization, and they provide drugs and pharmaceutical items and equipment to people in need. So they ship equipment across the world. And this right now is obviously in the context of COVID-19. And by making it more tangible what €5, €20 or €50 is going to buy, it also makes it more interesting for donors because they can immediately see the impact of their donation. The other thing is, if you want to go one step further, is that you can offer like small rewards in exchange for a gift. So that the more you give, the more interesting or the more valuable your reward is going to be. And in that area, you can be really creative, because often supporters, like if they wanted to just buy something, they would obviously go out and just buy it in the shops. So often you can reward supporters with like something that doesn't necessarily cost you much, but it means a lot to them. So be creative and think of potential rewards that you can use. That is also applicable to the next idea. So one of the things that can work really well in online fundraising is transactional donations. So you give supporters something in return. Often offering like a free t-shirt is not necessarily the best way to go, because that is not very unique. But if you can be a little creative and you can come up with ideas on what you already have available to you, or what you can easily create, or what kind of special experience you can provide your supporters with, then that can be very powerful. And you say, like, if you make a donation now, you will get this in return. Just an example of an animal welfare charity, they essentially gave away collars for pets, and people could put in the name of the pet, and that would be printed on the collar, and that would be sent to the supporter. That is just a very quick and easy example of how this can work. The next tip is develop an email journey for everyone who's made a one-off donation. One of the things that happen a lot in fundraising is that we go out and we collect money, then there's the next thing, and we jump to the next thing that we have to do, and we're again asking for money, and sometimes it can feel a bit disconnected. But think about it that way: those people who've already made a one-off donation, they are so much more likely to make a regular gift or to support the organization financially in future. That is really important to treat that relationship well, and to spend a lot of time making sure that that relationship actually develops. It's often much easier to work with existing relationships and improve them than to get loads of new people in. So if you have budget, you can either spend it on recruiting a lot of new people and getting a lot of new people exposed to your fundraising asks, or you can focus on building the relationship with the people that you already have. And both can be really important. Think about the model and how it's all connected, right? But what we're often forgetting is that by developing a small sequence of emails that can be sent to one-off donors, and then gradually asking them to make a regular contribution, that is something that is that can actually increase the number of regular donors you have quite a lot. So it doesn't have to be that complicated. What you can see on this screen is a diagram of like a very, very big email journey and email automation. It doesn't have to be complicated. Start with something simple, start with something small. That's already better than not communicating with these donors at all, or not communicating in a personalized way. What a lot of organizations are doing is that they're just sending these supporters or these donors the regular email newsletter. But these are not regular people, right? They've already made a donation, so you can acknowledge that they've done something that is fantastic, and therefore also build that relationship. So an example of what you can do is that you can send them loyalty content. So that is content that shows the impact of the donation. That is probably quite obvious, but by showing them the impact of the donation, you're reinforcing the idea that it's good to give and that it actually creates an impact, because at the end of the day, that is what people want to achieve when they give to charity in most cases. Then you can have specific engagement elements. So these can be things that are interactive and interesting, but not necessarily directly connected to fundraising. So that might be an online quiz, or it might be like a small online action that people can take to support your cause, but without giving. You can have campaigning actions, so such as petitions we've already mentioned, but there are a wide range of different campaigning activities and advocacy activities that you can integrate into that journey, into that sequence of emails. And eventually you can find a way to ask them for a regular donation. So only towards the end, once you've built that relationship and you've reinforced that donation, the donation is creating an impact, then you start asking for a regular donation. We won't be talking about email journeys and supporter journeys on this webinar much, so that was the only reference. If you are really interested in that, then feel free, like we have a free PDF report that you can download. We will send you the link later on that focuses only on building these email automations and how to make them really great. The next tip is to use on-page user flows. So that is sort of the to a certain extent, the opposite of the long-term approach. So, for an example, in this case, you have a pledge. So people are signing the pledge to say, yes, I will speak out for refugees in need, and then they will share that message. So right after this ask, you can actually ask them whether they would also like to make a donation or not. Ideally, you frame that in a way that it's just a way to make it to create even more impact, because people have already done something, and making a donation is even one step further. They can say yes or no, and that way you can actually chain multiple asks together. So if people choose no in this particular case, you can still ask them whether they would like to share the action or whether they would like to sign up as a volunteer, or you can ask them to do something else. But if they say yes, they can make a donation right away. Another example of this is from Freedom from Torture, which is an organization in the UK. And they also use the same principles. So they say, yes, would you like to chip in? Or no, thank you, not today. It's a very quick and easy way to receive one-off donations after online actions. Of course, as a campaigner, I'm not like putting my campaigning hat on. I have to warn you that like doing that too much might be a bit intrusive and may not work very well. But the more targeted you are and the more specific you can be, rather than including it on every single donation page, on every single page on your website and after actions, if you do that every once in a while, you will get a number of one-off donations from that. And that is great, but don't overdo it because that might annoy people. Now, as fundraisers, we often think of the online world and the offline world, and we talk about channels and we talk about different ways of reaching people. The truth is, there is no such thing as the online and the offline world. It's actually just one world. And remember that like your supporters, they don't necessarily differentiate that much between like receiving mail or receiving a call or receiving an email. Yes, it's a different experience, but they wouldn't categorize it in the same way as we do. They would probably rather have certain feelings about like the contents of the communications, or what that means for them, and have they been anticipating it? Are they excited about the contents of the message or not? So I'd like to encourage you, and that is the next tip, to also think about potentially converting supporters to become donors and recruiting donors through other channels. So you can use digital to, for an example, offer a package that can be ordered online. So in this case, it can be material about your campaign that supporters can order and distribute in their local area. It could also be something else. It could be, if you're doing a citizen science project, it could be some sort of test kit. It could be all sorts of different things that supporters may want to order. And then as you're sending them the leaflets or whatever, or the stickers, you can also ask them for a donation as part of that. And in that case, it feels very natural. So you can use that as a way to sort of ask for a donation for the first time. And you may get new donors in through that channel. So while it's not digital as such, think about the supporter experience. Think about the people you're talking to and you're interacting with, rather than thinking about specific channels. Sometimes it can be really effective to integrate digital with other means of communications that you're already doing, and that can be very effective. And the last tip is you can do the same thing with phone calls. So I'm not talking about the typical call center experience where you try and get through like 1,000 numbers every day and you ask them to make a donation. I'm talking about like very tailored and personal interactions. for an example, you can say, as people are taking action and you identify a specific group of people who are quite likely to make a donation because they've been very active, they've been very engaged, you can invite them to a phone call. In this case, they can just put in their phone number, and then you will call them a few days later and have a conversation. And as part of that conversation, obviously, you can also say, like, would you like to make a donation? That is another way that you could help us. So think about other ways that you can potentially ask for money and how that is integrated with your digital fundraising efforts. So to recap, we had the first 5 tips were fundraising by campaigning as a model. Think about how you can integrate the two and think about the activities that you're already doing and how that can be directly integrated with fundraising. Number 2, run a donation ask that is framed as an action. So it doesn't feel like giving money. It feels like taking an online action. It feels like being part of a movement. Step 3, fundraising by emergencies. So if there's an emergency, try and build your fundraising efforts around that and try and ask for something very specific as part of that. Tip number 4, create a donation ask that is very connected to the previous communications that person might have seen. Create something that is very tailored. Rather than asking for a donation in general, ask for a donation that is specific to that context, to the time, and to the issue that you've been working on. Number 5, start a crowdfunding action. So rather than asking for a general donation, ask people to give money for something very specific, tangible, and small, and be creative. Number 6, think of something that you can give in return to your donation. So if someone donates, what can you give them? Be creative and think of something that you can give back. Number 7, an email journey for everyone who's made a one-off donation. So these are emails that you send to everyone who's already made a one-off donation, and therefore you really work with that relationship and you make sure that these people are happy, so they will eventually become regular givers and make a monthly contribution. Number 8, use the on-page user flows while people are already taking action and weave fundraising asks into that. Don't overdo it, but do that and find ways to sort of be really creative on how you can sneak fundraising asks into existing user flows. Number 9, follow up via email. Via mail. There's the digital communicator in me who automatically reads email rather than mail. So follow up via mail. So send them a letter or give them something to order. So you have an excuse to send them a package. And as part of that package, you can also ask for a donation. And number 10, follow up via phone. So either offer a specific phone call to discuss how they can do even more for the organization, or find another way to get people's phone numbers and their agreement to receive a call from you, and then follow up. So thank you. These were the 10 tips to boost your online fundraising. Now another thank you to NGO-Academy, and we'll have a few more minutes for questions.
Thanks, Florian. I've got a question in, a really interesting question in from Jade, picking up on the point that you made about supporter journeys and moving from a single donation to a regular gift. So Jade's organisation have a monthly membership set up. So on a new supporter email journey, do you recommend asking for one-off donations before asking for a small monthly membership fee?
Well, generally speaking, my initial approach would be yes, to ask for one-off donations first, but at the end of the day, that really depends on so many different factors. So what I would advise to do is that you test that. You try both options and see what produces more regular donors at the end. Sometimes that can take a while until you have collected that information, because it may take a few months for people to sign up as members or as regular donors. But in many cases, it's easier to get people to make a one-off donation first.
Okay, and next question from Ina. Do you have any tips on social media fundraising?
Well, the way that we see social media is if you think about the model again, is that it's really integrated with everything else. So when you say social media fundraising, there are two things that you could mean. One is that you mean fundraising asks directly on Facebook, so people make donations through Facebook. And the other one is that you use social media to drive traffic to donation pages and to collect money. In both cases, I would say social media is great for the first steps. So it's great to get people's attention. It's great to reinforce specific stories. But at some point, if you want to build that connection and you want to make sure that you can also send them personalized emails, personalized communications and sort of tailored communications rather than everyone sees the same post on social media, then it's often better to switch to email as a channel. Because with email, you have the advantage of being able to track whether this particular person has received that email and open it and clicked on it. You have the ability to really personalize and tailor the contents of the email to where this person is at the moment. Are they already a supporter or not? Are they really engaged or not? Have they already given money before or not? So things like that can always be really tricky on social media. I hope that answers the question, but if it didn't quite answer it, feel free to post a follow-up and we'll answer that one too.
Yeah, yeah. Feel free to answer. Yeah, to pose follow-up questions. I'm monitoring the list. So, question from Balint: when designing donation platforms on your website, which technical options should you offer? Is PayPal enough, or should you also allow card payment? What share of potential donors might have a PayPal account?
That is a good question, but the answer is it's so different in every single country in Europe. You wouldn't believe it. So in most cases, or for most of the continent, it's a good idea to offer credit card payments, PayPal, as well as direct debit or SEPA payments. The reason is that if you want to have recurring payments, PayPal, for example, will always take a cut of these recurring payments. So it's not necessarily the cheapest for you to use those. Whereas if you have a SEPA mandate and you can use direct debit to get people's donation, that is often much cheaper, if not to say free, because you can process these yourselves via the bank. And credit cards are one of those things that are fairly international. But depending on the country that you live in, you will know what type of local payment habits people have. For an example, in the Netherlands, they have a separate platform that's called Ideal, and that is the one way that online payments are being made. So it very much depends on the organization that you work with, the context, and the country. But I would advise to try more than just PayPal. But think about the local context. What is it your friends and family are using when they make online payments?
Okay, thanks, Florian. Okay, next question. Could you share some experience with phone calls and what is the development of the relationship further? From Julia.
Well, first of all, I'm not an expert on telemarketing, which is sort of like a field on its own. But basically, what our experience is with that connection is if you build relationships online and you're starting to develop these relationships, and there is a point where you ask people to make a regular donation, and people don't do that for some reason, there are certain people who are much happier to have like a phone call and also agree to a monthly donation as part of that than doing that through the internet. So one way that we do that is that if sort of all other attempts have failed, so we've tried asking for a regular donation a few times, then we sometimes say, like, look, do you want to have a chat with us and see sort of what else you could be doing? And ideally, you call them really quickly after they've actually gave you their phone number and said, yes, please do call me. So try and make sure it happens within at least 1 or 2 days. Don't wait for 3 weeks, because they will have forgotten by then. Because that way you're setting the expectation that you will call them, so they won't be startled and sort of surprised by it. So that's the one thing. And the last thing is that you make sure, like, as you're talking to them on the phone, in the most successful cases that we've seen are organizations who take care of that in-house. So rather than going to a telemarketing agency, who makes all these calls. You have staff within your organization who's been trained to do that. And the reason why that's better is often because they're much more like they know the issues. They might be able to answer some of the questions about the issues. And the other thing is that they have like a very strong connection to your organization. So they can say like, well, if you don't want to make a donation, why don't you sign up as a volunteer? Or the other way around, like a lot of the volunteers that we have also make a financial contribution. Would you like to do that? So make sure that you have like a script that people can follow, where you write down sort of roughly how to go about when having these conversations, and try and reference what the person has already done. So try and find a way to say like, oh, thank you. We know you've been a great supporter of our organization. You've taken this action and you've already been to various events. So it's really great that you do that. Now, if you could also make a monthly contribution, that would be fantastic. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Florian. Okay, next question from Andrea. Do you think it's appropriate to start in the next months a fundraising campaign if your project is not related to the pandemic, for example, the environmental issues? Mm-hmm. So realistically speaking, do you think it would be effective at the moment?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, that is a real challenge. Like many of you, we've spent the past 2 months changing the contents and and what we're doing in pretty much every project that we're working on. So I think as we're in the middle of the pandemic and the news cycle is so focused on coronavirus and so focused on the impact of that, it can be very difficult to actually cut through the clutter and sort of like get your issue out there. So what we recommend is like, if you find a way to connect it somehow, then you may be able to be quite successful, because you also have to think about like people have to stay at home, so they might be a bit bored, or some people are really overwhelmed and the only time they can actually connect to the outside world is through the internet. So like we're in a very different situation. So I think the answer is, if you can connect it to the issue somehow, it might work, but you have to try. Like there's no guarantee. If you can't find a way to connect it to the issue, then you're going to struggle. But especially with environmental issues, we've found that like connecting it to the pandemic and the original source of the pandemic, and that connection to wildlife and diversity, and you can also connect it to the climate crisis because of the lockdown and all of that. So I think you can also be quite creative in terms of how you combine these issues. An example from the UK, from one of the organizations that we're working with Shelter. So they've very quickly launched a campaign about housing and the housing situation during COVID-19. That is an obvious connection, but you can also find less obvious connections and be a bit creative of how can it be connected to the current crisis.
Okay, there's a couple of follow-up questions about the phone question, which obviously, as you flagged, this is kind of slightly outside the kind of topic today, but just whether you have any thoughts about, I guess the question is about benchmarks. You know, is there an idea of what proportion of people actually want to be called, and is it more the case that older people want to be called rather than contacted digitally?
I think again that is something that very much depends on the country and the context. Like if you ask me whether I'd like to receive a phone call, I would definitely say no, thank you very much. Maybe if you, but like obviously that doesn't apply to everyone. So I think sort of try and imagine how it's like for people around you. Again, try and think of people who've not been in touch with the issue before, who are not like you, and then work from there and figure out whether it makes sense. At the end of the day, all you can do is just test it. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And if you're asking people and loads of people are signing up and you can call them and that's working for you, then that is great. I don't think there are any benchmarks or rules around this, because it depends on so many factors, especially considering like the different countries that we all operate in.
Okay, another new question. Do you have a successful example of a fundraising campaign on a cultural topic or for cultural reasons? Most of the examples I've seen are for charity or environment, and then just to kind of flesh that out, not so much kind of arts organisations as such as theatres or museums, but more kind of small local NGOs, so cultural walks, small seminars, cultural topics or subcultures. So is this stuff transferable to those kinds of topics?
I think to a certain degree, yes. It always depends on the focus of sort of the organization and the main activities. One side could be, if you're talking about more like seminars and workshops and the likes, I would consider that to be more like a service operated organization. So your donors, or the people who are most likely to make a contribution, are the people who are actually attending these seminars and who are receiving these services, or in the connection. The other side is if you are more in the business of sort of providing a space or providing okay, that's also quite service oriented. I think sometimes it makes sense to have like something that's more around making something very specific happen. Like if you have a community center and you need to raise money to be able to establish that community center, it's more like a crowdfunding experience. But again, in both cases, this is very much connected to what you can provide as a service, or what you can provide to the community around you. So it's most likely that these people will be happy to make a donation, if that makes sense.
Okay, one more question. Should we stick with only national languages, or should we make our campaigns in English as well?
I think again that very much depends on your issue and your supporter base. So if you think it's most likely that you will be able to raise money from within the country that you operate in, then that makes a lot of sense. If you think that opening up another country and sort of collecting money, for an example, if you want to collect, if you're operating in Romania, for example, there are a lot of organizations who are receiving funds from other countries and who run fundraising campaigns in other countries to make the work they're doing in Romania possible. That is just one example. So I think it very much depends on your issue. There's no fixed answer to that. But I would not. I don't think that just making it available in English is going to get the job done. I think in most cases you will want to focus on one specific other country, one specific other market, and then find a way to attract donors in that specific country with very targeted measures and actions.
Interesting question. A more practical question from Nina. As a fundraiser, do you think it's absolutely necessary to have a LinkedIn or Twitter account? I'm assuming Nina means corporately rather than personally.
Well, I think like whether you have whether you use a social media platform, and both of these are essentially social media platforms, only one is more geared towards professionals and one is more geared towards real-time news. I think in both cases you just have to ask yourself who am I trying to reach, and does it matter for that? Is it going to help me or not? And if the answer is yes, then yes. I think as a fundraiser, in most cases, you will be talking with the voice of the organization. So it's less about you as a person, it's more about the organization as a whole, right? So while you can use your own social media channels and accounts as a way to then reach new people for the organization, that's definitely something that you can try. But in most cases, you will be talking as the organization anyway. So the answer is it depends. In most cases, it's probably not as relevant as you might think.
Okay, follow-up point from Nina. It's more about how much of my privacy I need to give up. So I guess this is about kind of, do I, as personally as a fundraiser, should I be having a LinkedIn or Twitter presence?
I think the question here is like, can you find a way to present your organization in a really authentic way? One way to do that is to use individuals who represent the organization, and then every message is sort of sent from Nina at this organization. Or so if that is that's definitely something that works and that we can recommend. However, if you have someone else in your organization who has that role to represent and sort of is happy to put their face to the organization, then it makes more sense to just sign all the communications with their name, and then you don't have to like be publicly visible at all, if you ask me.
Okay, thanks for that question, Nina. And one more question. What are your predictions about donors' activities and how they will change their habits in the future regarding COVID-19 and the economic crisis?
That is obviously I don't obviously I don't know what's going to happen in like a year from now, and anyone who claims that they know that is probably not very trustworthy. So, but like there are certain things or certain scenarios that could be happening. First of all, one thing is that we've seen donations drop in certain segments quite significantly. And part of that is, I think, due to the news cycle. So if there's only one topic out there and everyone's just talking about that, other issues are less relevant. The other reason why I think that has happened is because if people are already giving towards something that seems very urgent, like the coronavirus crisis, then they may be more reluctant to give to other causes. So if you can't make that connection to COVID-19, then that can be a problem. And the third thing is that obviously if people are scared and they're they're sort of in shock and they're worried about their own economic sort of state and what's going to happen to them, are they going to lose their job, how they're going to pay the rent, but then that also can have the effect that they're less likely to actually think about others, less likely to sort of connect with charities and give money. It can also be the other way around. Like we've seen evidence of both, so it's very difficult to say. However, as a sector, what I think that's definitely happening, and that's already happening, is that because all your events have been cancelled, if you do street face-to-face fundraising in the streets, that's no longer possible. If you do any sporting events that are sponsored and that help you with fundraising, that's no longer possible. So all of these things, all of these activities are currently just on hold. So what we have seen is that obviously digital is a channel that like now a lot of charities are starting to adopt digital as a new channel for fundraising because they've sort of treated it as like almost like a pet project until now. So what I think that is definitely going to happen with the sector is that this sort of process of digital transformation is speeding up. So a lot of organizations are now getting to the point where they have to work remotely, so they have to equip their staff with digital tools, and they have to do online fundraising because that is one of the channels that's still around. So I think that we could probably spend an entire day or potentially an entire week just talking about how the pandemic and the economic crisis is going to affect the sector and fundraising activities. But I think that's sort of like an overview of my thinking. I hope it's helpful.
Okay, thanks, Florian. We've got no more new questions, so do we want to just maybe give people one more minute to post a final thought or a final question before we close?
Mm-hmm.
So last chance. Okay, that's all the questions for now. Always at the moment I speak. Okay, how much donor communication is too much?
That is a good question. The short answer is you'll have to test. Like again, it depends on the target audience, who you're talking to. But in most cases, like if you can keep the quality up, so it's really relevant and good communications rather than just filling another email, then I don't think that can be too much. I know that like in some cases it can lead to sort of certain individuals being overwhelmed, but in most cases where we've tested it, it's probably not possible to produce a lot of high quality and really relevant content at a frequency that is actually too much. So I've not seen that happen yet. I mean, do prove me wrong, but in most cases, what people end up doing is just sending loads of less relevant content. So if you have a huge list of content that you could be sending, or a huge list of interesting offers, and you prioritize them by how interesting and how relevant they are for donors, and you sort of the bottom 50% is not being sent, then you can probably send all of that, even if it's a lot.
Yeah, I don't think you can ever bore your supporters as long as you're being interesting. They don't mind being sent stuff as long as it stays interesting. Okay, so we had 2 more questions. So one from Veronica about, is it better to ask for a specific value? So just asked for some qualification for that. So in a fundraising campaign, so I assume that's when you go out with an email and you're asking specifically, is it better to ask for a specific sum, or is it better to be more vague?
Our experience is that in the beginning, especially in the beginning, asking for a very specific amount is better. In most cases, what we end up doing is offering 2 to 3 very specific amounts, because that can give people a sense of, well, it works on multiple levels. First of all, it can give people a sense of, this is what we think is appropriate, this is what other people are giving. So you're also setting an expectation by giving people a specific amount. The other thing is, if you have one amount that is very low, it can feel like an easy way in. So it can feel like a very low bar to give like €4 or €3 to a charity. That is not a lot of money. That's pretty much lunch, right? So making it possible to also encouraging small donations can be effective. And the last thought is, if you have 3 values, people often go for the middle. That is sort of like a psychological phenomenon. So if you have like 3 options, what you might see is that the middle option is most popular. So generally speaking, we do recommend going for specific amounts. Sometimes it makes sense to have multiple amounts on there. But the more specific you ask, and the clearer it is how this specific amount is connected to the impact, the better.
And that's another argument for good segmentation in your list, isn't it? So you're anchoring those amounts at the level that's appropriate for what that person's already done. Okay, one more question. What advice can you give with regard to using pictures, so particularly around avoiding stigmatization? From Ramona.
That is a good question. I don't have a whole lot prepared for that, but like I think what has happened in the past in fundraising is that only the short-term monetary result was at the focus of like choosing a picture. So most fundraisers, the way that you go about is that you test different pictures against each other, and you see which picture produces the most donations. However, if you try and be slightly more sustainable, and you also take ethical considerations into account, you might end up choosing a different picture that gets you less money in the short term, but these people who give, they might stick around for much longer. So I think you can actually look at it from 2 angles. First of all is the purely financial angle, and in that sense you absolutely have to test pictures against each other and use the image that works best. And the other one is the ethical one, and I think you have to obviously if you want to stick to specific ethical guidelines, then those are your constraints. And if you do a lot of testing, you will probably find a picture that performs just as well, even though it doesn't violate your ethical guidelines. I'm not sure whether that's helpful, but in my experience it's usually organizations that have just been using the same kind of imagery for such a long time, and they know that works because they've been using it for a long time, that they can often be a bit of a challenge to get that organization to then adopt a new approach and also try and find new approaches that work equally well.
Thanks, Florian. I know there's some really interesting research in the UK that was done with audiences in the UK, France and Germany, I think particularly around this issue in relation to imagery and international development. So I can see if I can dig that out and drop you an email, Ramona. See if that's at all useful. Okay, last chance for questions. Okay, that's all the questions then, Florian. Back to you.
All right, so thank you very much. You can find us on our website, and you can also email me directly if you have any further questions. Obviously, if you need support with either strategy of your fundraising asks or any of the other areas of work that we're involved in, feel free to reach out. We will definitely follow up with an email with the slides and with some of the content that's been referenced. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it was helpful and you can apply that to your work. Thank you and goodbye.